Imagine a world where your greatest weapon to cripple a rival, economic sanctions, is turned back on you. Where your adversary not only survives, but innovates, adapts, and turns your own measures into weakness. That is exactly what's happening now. US sanctions designed to isolate China, constrict its growth, and hinder its global ambitions are failing. Worse, China may have found a powerful workaround. In this video, we reveal how Washington's leverage is slipping, how Beijing is rewriting the rules, and what it all means for the next era of global power. Stay tuned. What you think you know about sanctions might be wrong. What are US sanctions and export controls trying to do? Restrict China's access to critical advanced technologies, chips, semiconductors, dual-use goods. Impose economic pain, deter certain behavior, e.g. military tech, coercion, trade abuses. Signal to allies and rivals, we have tools of power beyond military force. The foundational assumption, the US and its allies sit atop the global financial and technological order, control over key choke points, systems, SWIFT, dollar dominance, chip supply chains, etc. If you cut off a target's access to that system, you impose a real, crippling cost. But here's the twist. China is not just a passive actor. It is a smart, resourceful, and determined one. When cornered, it looks for workarounds. When standard paths are blocked, it builds new ones. In this video, we'll examine how China is evading, outmaneuvering, and countering sanctions, and why the US must rethink its approach. A. Leaks and loopholes. Even well-designed sanctions often have gaps. Entities can hide behind shell companies, obscure ownership structures, third-country intermediaries. US sanctions frequently rely on secondary sanctions, threatening punishment for those aiding sanctioned parties. But enforcement is hard, global, and uneven. Example: some Chinese firms export advanced chips via third countries or subsidiaries not clearly linked, making tracing and enforcement far more complex. The academic paper, Chip, The Futility of Hardware-Centric Export Controls, argues precisely that US export controls are widely known to be permeable, and that China is designing systems to evade them. In other words, every brand new restriction prompts new evasion tactics. It's almost like a game of whack-a-mole. B. Case: China-Russia trade workaround. Russia, under severe Western sanctions, still trades heavily with China. How? By routing payments through smaller regional Chinese banks that fly under the radar. Instead of using large, internationally exposed banks, which the US can easily target, Moscow and Beijing resort to non-resident accounts, NRAs, smaller local banks, fragmentation of transactions. These are slower, more cumbersome paths, but they work. The very fact that transactions continue, despite pressure, shows that the sanction chokehold is not absolute. C. China's restraint in retaliations, and the legal scaffolding. China has its own anti-foreign sanctions law, passed 2021, as a countermeasure tool, signaling Beijing can respond to foreign sanctions. But in practice, China has been cautious about directly hitting back at US firms broadly, focusing instead on targeted countermeasures or constraining subsidiaries of foreign firms in China. Why the caution? Because cutting off too many ties risks also hurting China's own access to the global trading and financial system, a delicate balance. Thus, the sanctions regime is not airtight. China is actively probing and penetrating its weak points. Here is how China is adapting and building alternative systems to blunt US leverage. 1. Barter and in-kind deals. When money flow is restricted, trade in goods for service or goods for goods becomes viable. A vivid example: China pays for Iranian oil not in dollars or traditional financing, but by agreeing to build infrastructure in Iran via Chinese companies, insurers, and state institutions. The mechanism: oil shipments go to China. Payment doesn't go through banned banks. Instead, a Chinese entity called Chuxin, backed by Sinosure, a state insurer, credits Iranian suppliers. Then Chinese contractors build work in Iran. The loop is closed without using the global banking network. This kind of barter structure reduces reliance on dollars or formal payment channels. 2. Shadow fleet/dark tankers/ship-to-ship transfers. China has been building or leveraging a shadow/or dark/fleet. Tankers and vessels operating off the radar, disabling tracking, using flags of convenience, engaging in mid-sea ship-to-ship transfers, or blending oil cargoes to hide origin. This shadow fleet helps China import oil from Iran, Venezuela, or Russia despite sanctions constraints. By obscuring vessel identity, location, or cargo origin, the global monitoring systems, AIS, satellite tracking, sanction lists, struggle to trace these transactions. 3. Fragmentation and decentralization of banking. Instead of large, centralized banks that are easy targets, China and its partners increasingly use smaller, regional local banks that can fly under the radar. Transactions are broken into smaller slices, below thresholds that trigger scrutiny, spread across many institutions and geographies. Non-resident accounts, subsidiaries in neutral third countries, shell companies, and layered ownership all help obfuscate the ultimate beneficiaries. Also, in some cases, sanctioned firms own only minority stakes, less than threshold percentages, to avoid the automatic triggering of sanctions. 4. Technological substitutions and innovation. When a direct chip or technology supply is blocked, China invests heavily in homegrown development, alternative architectures, or software/AI optimization that demands less from hardware. The paper Wackerchip shows how Chinese AI labs are deploying models that squeeze more performance out of less capable hardware, thus reducing reliance on the most advanced and sanctioned chips. China also uses third-country procurement, dual-use procurement via neutral nations, or buys components disguised in innocuous products. Innovation under pressure. Constraints often spark leaps rather than slowdowns. 5. Decoupling from the dollar, building alternative financial systems. China is gradually pushing for currencies other than the US dollar in bilateral trade with partners like Russia, Iran, and many developing countries. Expanding use of digital yuan and alternative settlement systems is part of Beijing's long-term plan to reduce dependence on Western-led infrastructure. In global supply chains, China embeds itself deeply in upstream segments, making disentanglement costly for its trade partners. A recent study notes that despite disruptions, China's export resilience and structural embedding in global value chains remain strong. Let's zoom in on one of the most striking and reported examples: how China keeps importing Iranian oil despite US sanctions. The hidden funding conduit China is alleged to use, Chuxin, a little-known Chinese financial entity, paired with Sinosure, the state export credit insurer, to manage transactions. Iranian oil exports, approximately $8+ billion annually, are deposited to Chuxin, which then credits payments to Iranian counterparties. But those credits are used to fund Chinese infrastructure contracts inside Iran. The arrangement largely sidesteps global banking systems, oil blending, ship-to-ship, origin masking. Before reaching Chinese ports, the oil is often mixed or blended with other cargoes so the original Iranian origin is harder to detect. Ships transfer oil mid-sea to other vessels or change transponders/flags to obscure tracking. By the time the oil lands, paperwork claims irrelevant origin. Onshore storage and leases. China reportedly uses leased storage tanks, e.g. in Dalian, Zhoushan, for Iranian oil bought years earlier when waiver programs existed. When US waivers ended, China sold or dispatched oil from those reserves in covert ways, mislabeling origins. This gives Beijing buffer flexibility. It can draw on stored reserves and gradually integrate them into its energy supply under disguise. Sanctions pushback, denials, and limits. US authorities have tried to sanction portions of this network, vessels, owners, shell companies. But many links remain hidden. China formally denies any illicit arrangement. Both sides engage in a shadow war. US monitors, tracks, exposes. China adapts, hides, and replaces nodes. This example is powerful because it shows how even the most scrutinized sectors, oil, energy, strategic resources, are not immune. The playbook is clever, adaptable, and opaque. China's success in evading or neutralizing sanctions is not just tactical. It points to deeper structural advantages, US weaknesses, and changing rules of global power. A. Over-reliance on technical choke points. The US has long assumed that control of certain choke points, dollar, global finance, advanced tech exports, gives it leverage, but Beijing is chipping away at that control. As China builds parallel systems, alternative supply chains, and non-dollar trade corridors, US leverage erodes. B. Enforcement limitations, lack of global alignment. Effective sanctions depend on global cooperation and enforcement, but not every country wants to enforce US mandates. Some nations are neutral or sympathetic, others sidestep via lax jurisdictions. The US export control apparatus has been criticized for under-resourcing and over-reliance on voluntary compliance by US firms. C. Self-inflicted constraints. The US must tread carefully. Overly aggressive sanctions risk blowback, alienate allies, or weaken its own firms. Sanctions carry diplomatic, legal, and geopolitical costs. China often threatens countermeasures. The anti-foreign sanctions law grants Beijing legal cover to retaliate. D. Exponential adaptation and innovation. Sanctions can slow progress, but they also incentivize breakthroughs. China is investing heavily in semiconductor R&D, supply chain independence, and alternative architectures. Restrictions push China to dig in, innovate, and find substitutes. So rather than imposing permanent damage, sanctions may even accelerate the target's efforts. E. Deep integration in global supply chains. China is deeply embedded in global manufacturing, raw material processing, intermediate goods, and logistics. Decoupling is costly for many countries. A study of global supply chain reallocation during recent crises found that despite disruptions, China remained deeply embedded in upstream segments and was resilient. Many foreign firms depend on China for completeness of supply chains. That mutual dependency gives Beijing bargaining power. While China's workaround strategies are formidable, they are not without risk or limitations. This section balances the narrative. Risks to China. Exposure to secondary sanctions. If Beijing's banks or entities are found to facilitate illicit financial flows, they risk being blacklisted, cut off from dollar systems. The larger financial institutions are cautious because losing access to global markets is a real threat. Higher costs, inefficiency workarounds, barter, fragmentation, shadow networks are less efficient, more opaque, riskier, sometimes slower, and more expensive. Breaking transactions into many microtransactions increases overhead and risk of detection. Strategic exposure and retaliation. The US has tools: visa bans, sanctions of vessels, blacklisting, legal pressure on third parties, diplomatic pressure. The US may expand its reach via tighter administrative controls, e.g. auto-adding subsidiaries of blacklisted firms to entity lists. Escalation and systemic breakdown. If the system becomes too adversarial, global trade fragmentation could raise costs, reduce efficiencies, and trigger backlash across the world. Some states may try to insulate themselves from conflict and avoid aligning too deeply. What the US must rethink and could do: better enforcement intelligence, red flag detection, close loopholes, focus on detecting suspicious spikes, shell companies, cross-border flows, intermediaries. Use sectoral sanctions, targeting entire industries rather than narrow individual listings. Expand capacity in export control agencies, raise fines, invest in compliance monitoring. Targeting service providers, enablers, third parties. Not just blacklisting major firms, but also auditing entities that support the chain: insurance, logistics, shell companies, auditors. If service providers fear liability, the cost of evasion rises. Allied coordination and unified frameworks. Sanctions are stronger when backed by a coalition. Breaking unified rules weakens the regime. Pressure neutral or friendly third countries to tighten compliance. Adaptive policy, modular controls. Don't rely solely on static tech bans. Combine tariffs, export licenses, screening, incentives, alternative trade policies. Update the rules as technology evolves, anticipating future paths. Strengthen alternative leverage points. For example, intellectual property, trade agreements, standards governance, supply of critical raw materials. Use carrots, investment, partnerships, not just sticks. Recognize the limits of coercion. Sanctions are not magic. They can pressure, but rarely fully control. The US must reconcile with a more multipolar world in which it cannot always dictate terms unilaterally. What this means for the future: shifting norms of sovereignty and finance. As China builds alternative systems, financial, tech, trade, the liberal order may face fragmentation. Countries may choose to route around US systems to reduce vulnerability. Acceleration of arms race in technologies. China's push for self-reliance in chips, AI, and telecom will intensify. The tension between control and innovation becomes a central battleground. Global realignment and China plus one strategies. Some countries may hedge, maintain ties with both the US and China, or diversify supply chains to avoid overdependence. But completely disentangling from China will be costly and slow, given its scale and integration. Sanction fatigue and diminishing returns. Over time, repeated rounds of sanctioning may produce diminishing impact as targets adapt faster. The shock value declines, resilience grows, geopolitical risk and escalation potential. The more the system fractures, the more potential for trade wars, blockades, retaliation, and instability. Economic coercion could spill into politics, military competition, and diplomatic ruptures. The US believed it held the tools of dominance. But in this new age, dominance requires more than gates and locks. It demands agility, imagination, and cooperation. China's workarounds are not proof that sanctions are useless, but evidence that the rules are changing. If Washington wants to maintain leverage, it needs to evolve. Better enforcement, smarter targeting, allied coordination, and a recognition that coercion alone will no longer suffice. Because in this covert war of systems, the side that adapts wins. Thank you for joining this deep dive. If you found this insightful, like, comment, and subscribe, and let us know. What do you think the US should do next to stay ahead? Until next time, keep watching the hidden chessboard behind global power.